excited today to have Dr. Ed Folsom, class of 69, here to talk to all of you. He will be receiving a Distinguished Achievement Citation this weekend. And at Ohio Wesleyan, Ed was an English major, a member of Phi Delta Theta, Omicron Delta Kappa, and Phi Beta Kappa. He also was active in WCSA and WSLN radio. Following his graduation, Ed earned a Master of Arts degree in English and a PhD in English and American Literature from the University of Rochester. He is currently the Roy J. Carver Professor of English at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. Ed's scholarly work, especially related to the life and writings of Walt Whitman, has made him the nation's and world's go-to Whitman expert. Ed's books include Walt Whitman, The Measure of His Song, Walt Whitman's Native Representations, and Walt Whitman and the World. In fall 2005, he organized a symposium on Whitman as a bookkeeper and curated a large exhibit at the University of Iowa Museum of Art of all the books Whitman made. Ed has been featured on national outlets such as the PBS documentary series The American Experience, NPR's Talk of the Nation, On the Media, and Morning Edition, What's My Word, Fox News In Depth, and CBS Sunday Morning, all on the myriad aspects of Whitman's work and life. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ed Folsom.
It's really terrific to be here and see old classmates, meet new fellow alums, and welcome back to my great delight, Lyman Weathers and Randy Waldron, two of my professors when I was here in the late 60s. Randy was the young new guy my senior year, and I still remember sitting out at Randy's apartment. Randy had us out for dinner, and looking at your collection of books, which you were pretty ashamed of at that time because you didn't think that was much of a library for a PhD in English, and I was totally blown away by it. I aspired to it, and it's an evening I remember. Lyman Weathers was here the entire time. I've had the great honor to be in touch with both of these gentlemen on my work in Whitman and American literature since I've left. Both of them actually have written for me, written for the journal that I edit, and Lyman has done reviews of Whitman music for me, and it's a great honor to have them back here. I know a lot of you will remember Lyman and Randy as well. When I come back to Delaware, this is the first time I've been back since the late 90s. I always do what I did this morning, which is just walk around the campus and reset memories. I walked into Phillips Hall today because I had a seminar there with Ben Spencer, and I've been thinking a lot about it. It was a modern poetry seminar, and I went up to find the room, and it's now, I discovered, education department up there, and there are murals on the wall, and the murals were made by elementary school kids with the teachers' aides who helped them construct the murals. And the one that's up there for science is called magnetism, and it's a giant magnet. And inside that giant magnet are three figures: a woman with a child and another woman. And as you look at that painting, you realize that the science of magnetism is what the object of the painting is, and yet what you really feel in the painting is the magnetism between the human figures in the painting. It's a beautiful little painting, and I was thinking of that because I came to Ohio Wesleyan as a pre-med major. I was pretty convinced, in whatever way 18-year-olds are convinced that they're going to be physicians, and I took a lot of science courses while I was here, but I kept finding myself drawn to the English courses and eventually majored in English and had the delight really of having never left that stage of my life. I mean, those of you who teach know what I'm talking about. Ben Spencer once said to me, the thing that's greatest about being a professor and also the scariest is you never grow up. And it's true, you know, students come and go, and eventually people start telling you how many students you've taught and how many courses you have, and your students go on and accomplish great things, and people associate that with you sometimes, and it makes you feel good, but day by day, you're still having the same conversations with 19-year-old, 20-year-old students that you remember having when you were here at Ohio Wesleyan. And it's interesting how many times a career as a college teacher really is a career in a lot of things, but it's I think mostly a career in learning how to remain passionate about what it is that you're teaching. It's fairly easy to be passionate about it the first few times through. Then you either begin moving on to something else to teach, or you begin thinking of other ways to do it. I've stayed with one figure for a long time, the American writer Walt Whitman. And Whitman has taken me in a lot of places over the years. Physically taken me in a lot of places as I've taught with people around the world where there's a real interest in Whitman. Whitman has different existences in different cultures as he's been absorbed and translated and read in relationship to other cultures. And so in China, he was read very much as a proto-communist writer. Guo Moreau, who was Mao Zedong's culture minister, was one of Whitman's first major translators in China. And through Guo Moreau, Mao Zedong read Walt Whitman. In India, Walt Whitman is read very much as a Western yoga master. And you'll get books coming out of India with titles like Maha Yoga Walt Whitman, reading Song of Myself as Western yogic discipline. When I was at Ohio Wesleyan, I'm often asked how I first got interested in Whitman. And I took an American Romantics course with Ben Spencer, who said at the beginning of the course, we're not going to do Whitman in this course because you're getting an American Realists. And I took American Realists, and the professor said, we're not going to do Whitman in this course because you're getting an American Romantics. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. A guy that seems to belong everywhere and nowhere. You know, a guy that could fit in either place but doesn't exactly fit either place. And I went through graduate school without having a course in Whitman either. When I went to finally the University of Iowa to begin teaching in the late 70s, students would say to me, you know, it's kind of crazy that we never study Walt Whitman here. Nobody teaches Whitman, such a major figure. And I had been hired as a 20th century literature person, and really had worked my way back to Whitman through 20th century poets, because 20th century poets always seemed to have to talk to Walt Whitman. Whitman talked forward to them, and they talked back to Walt Whitman. And so I kind of worked my way back to Whitman, and then I've stayed there because it keeps taking me out to all kinds of different places in the culture. I've gotten interested in 19th century bookmaking and 19th century sports and 19th century photography and 19th century American Indian policy and all of these things through beginning to work with Walt Whitman. The last year I was here, 1969, Beagley Library across the way was a brand new building. And we were all class of 69, Sharon and Doug remember this, what an amazing change Beagley was. Beagley Beach, we used to call it, and you would go into Beagley, and it just after Slocum, was that the name of the library? Slocum Library was just a kind of amazing thing, and I remember feeling kind of both glad I got a year in it, but sad that I didn't have 4 years in Beagley Library. And one of the first exhibits at Beagley was this exhibit on the Whitman collection. And I've always kept the little exhibition catalog, which I'll pass around here. It was a kind of transformative moment for me, because to that point I really hadn't been aware of the treasures that were in the Beagley Special Collections. And this began to open it up for me, and when I eventually did begin teaching Whitman and focusing on Whitman in my own writing and scholarship, I always remembered that exhibit. And I came back to Ohio Wesleyan and went through that collection in the late 70s. Randy Waldron had been working in the collection and had told me about some of the things he'd been finding there. And over the years, as I developed the Walt Whitman Archive, this online teaching and research resource for Whitman that now has about 30,000 users a week around the world. A lot of that material that we have brought together and made available worldwide comes from Beagley Library. This is where we began to put together all of the Whitman photographs. Whitman kept an old geography book that he disbound himself. He was a bookmaker, and he knew how to do this kind of thing. So he disbound the book and he bound it again with blank leaves in it, and then he would paste newspaper pieces and magazine pieces about various places in the world. And it's really how he taught himself global geography, so that he could make his poetry feel more global. So when I was talking about the global Whitman for the title here today, and thinking about taking Whitman from Beagley to the world, that really has been that kind of a movement. It's interesting to me that Whitman is the one major American literature figure I never had taught to me. And I've often thought it's because of that I've always remained obsessed with him. Those of you that had professors here like Ben Spencer know how amazingly convincing Ben Spencer could be about the way he would teach you a particular author. And I still have ways of thinking about those authors that Ben Spencer gave me. And I'm not smart enough to have worked my way out of those. But he never gave me Walt Whitman. And so I've had to construct my own sort of loose, inchoate idea of who this Whitman figure is. So for the few minutes that we've got together, I thought, well, this is a class, so we should read a Whitman poem or two and think about them. I was thinking too about where you all might have encountered Whitman and may not even have been consciously aware of it. He shows up so often. I was going to through some of the various editions of Leaves of Grass. I want to get to some various readers of Whitman. We've got Marilyn, we've got Lisa Simpson, and you can't see this one very well because of the light, but that's, those of you that watch Breaking Bad, that's Hank Schrader sitting on the toilet reading Leaves of Grass. And those of you that follow Breaking Bad know that that was one of the key moments in the entire series of Breaking Bad. And Whitman kept coming up in Breaking Bad again and again. A poem that was quoted in its entirety was a little poem called When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. And I thought that's a little poem we can look at together today. And then just to show you this, it's a daguerreotype that was recently discovered by a daguerreotype collector in Tennessee. And it's an 1856 daguerreotype. And this is a woman holding a copy of the 1856 Leaves of Grass. It would have been a brand new copy of Leaves of Grass, Whitman's book. Right? The interesting thing about this daguerreotype is that it's the only photograph we have taken during Whitman's lifetime of a reader actually reading Leaves of Grass. And the idea that it's an anonymous woman reading is really fascinating. The 1856 edition is the book, the edition of Leaves of Grass. It's always often called the women's edition because it has a number of poems in it that Whitman wrote about women's issues and women's rights. And there are a lot of women's rights advocates in the 19th century that began quoting Whitman at this time. So the idea that it would be this young woman and that she's got that book, I don't know how many of you have looked at a lot of daguerreotypes in the 19th century, but it's extremely rare to find someone holding a book that you can tell the title of. The exception is the Bible. There are a lot of photographs of people holding Bibles. And there are a lot of photographs and daguerreotypes of people holding books, but you can't tell what book they're holding or sitting next to a stack of books. But this one has that Leaves of Grass so clearly visible, and she's put it down just as if she's been reading it. That's exactly how the book would appear if you were holding it and then put it down on your lap to pause while the picture was taken. And there's a kind of intimacy of reading. And as those other photographs I showed you suggest, starting in the 20th century, a kind of tradition of having yourself photographed reading Whitman. And part of that is Whitman always talking to you, the reader. And it's part of what Whitman sets his poems up to be, you up there. As if he's speaking to you right off the page and seeing your face, looking down at it. So I wanted you to see these, and then to look at a commercial with you. That, by the way, is the Whitman archive that I work on. If you're ever interested, you can just Google Whitman archive. It'll pop right up. And on this archive are literally millions of pages of every edition of Leaves of Grass, Whitman's manuscripts. What we're soon to have up there is the scans of that entire geography book from Ohio Wesleyan here. That scans were made of a year or so ago. Really beautiful scans of that book. You can find criticism, biography, you can find all known photographs of Whitman, all of his poetry manuscripts and so on, and see them, all of his letters, both letters to Whitman and letters from Whitman, and you can see the manuscripts as well. Well, we shouldn't have done that. I'm going to get it again.
LASIK at LASIK Plus is the best decision I've ever made.
I wanted someone that had tons of experience.
The doctors were.
All right, here's the end.
America. Center of equal growth, equal size, all alike in food. Grow, ungrow, young or old, strong, able, fair, enduring, able, will. Romeo with the earth, with freedom, law, and love.
Have you all seen that before? It ran for a couple of months, about 3 years ago, and Levi's, the advertising agency, San Francisco advertising agency that put this together, and they contacted me with the Whitman archive because I had gotten this recording of Whitman's voice. That recording that you heard that was playing with the ad was Whitman reading a late 1880s poem called America, Center of Equal Daughters, Equal Sons. And they made a nice donation to the archive, and then they turned the ad over to a very talented, creative Japanese-American director named Cary Fukunaga, who has done a number of feature films, but he was basically told, just basically make a poem, or make a film of this poem. So you've got that odd little Whitman poem, Center of Equal Daughters, Equal Sons, all alike endeared, growing, ungrown, young, old, rich, poor, strong, ample, fair, enduring, capable, rich, perennial with the earth, with freedom, law, and love. It's not quite the end of the poem. There are 2 more lines, but the recording stops there. Whether Whitman stopped it, whether that's all that fit onto the wax cylinder that it was originally recorded on, we don't know. But he stops with that line, freedom, law, and love. Really odd group of 3 terms. Freedom, law, love. Okay? So how do you think that sells Levi's? Equal? There are for everybody, yeah. That's one thing that definitely is playing there for Levi's. Levi's had just gone through, at the time they made this ad, some really bad publicity because they'd shut down their last American plant in San Antonio. So that starting several years ago, all Levi's are made out of the country. So they've always been a brand that's been associated with that sort of tough American Western spirit, right? And now, to their horror, to the horror of the advertising agency that represents them, they're being talked about in at least the financial press as another company that's abandoned American workers, right? So one thing is that association, again, that you get with the kind of tough, young, working class group of people that seems to be the subject of Fukunama's film there. But I don't know if you remember the beginning of it and the end, where you see a sort of neon sign of America that's half submerged in the water. It's a really haunting kind of not necessarily optimistic image about the country. And while you get the fireworks at the end, there's something strange and pent up about a lot of the imagery that you're seeing there. Anything else selling Levi's jeans here?
Walt would have liked it. I think Walt would have liked it.
You wouldn't like the ad? Why do you think that, Randy?
Well, because in his all-encompassing optimism, he included commerce in many ways.
Yeah.
All over the place.
Yeah, it's interesting that Levi's is also a company that was very supportive as a corporation of gay rights. Now, there's nothing in this ad that's distinctly or directly having to do with gay rights, but you've got that poem about equal daughters, equal sons, all alike and dear, so on and so on. And then you have it ending with a kiss. I don't know, again, I know how it's tough to see this in this light, but the final image that you saw was a kiss between a white woman and a black man. And that cross-racial kiss becomes a really interesting thing when you think of how in most of our lifetimes we've gone from a country where cross-racial marriage was in some states illegal to now having that be such an accepted right that it's beyond discussion. And at the moment this ad was playing, the other new civil right, gay marriage, was being talked about everywhere. And so you had this poem that ends with the idea of freedom, law, and love. The idea that in America, as Whitman is suggesting in this poem, it's the land of freedom, but it's a land of laws. And those laws are continually being adapted as freedom expands. The laws change, and what drives that change is love, right? It's freedom pushing on the laws generated by love. So freedom, law, and love becomes a really interesting ending just before that explosion and then the sign of those people heading off into some inchoate future that becomes driven by that love. So it's interesting how even the ad agency is working on on the poem have emerged with something that is a kind of thought-provoking ad. And I followed the kind of responses to this ad. They're, again, a whole new world that Whitman opened to me. I didn't even realize there are journals devoted to analyzing ads. Okay? And they basically come out of the advertising industry. But that ad generated a lot of controversy. And Whitman has popped up in ads even more recently. Some of you may have seen ads for a new iPad that quote Whitman. So,
And what year did you write that poem? What year was that?
1887.
And could we see it again now that we know more about it?
Sure, yeah, you want to see the ad?
and love.
So what I've just given you, I've given you a section of Whitman's long poem, Song of Myself. And at the top, that little poem I mentioned that appears at a couple of key points in the TV series Breaking Bad. Here. So here's a little poem by Whitman, and it's a poem about, I've thought about it many, many times over the years since graduating from Ohio Wesleyan, and thinking about myself in science classrooms. Whitman's in a lecture hall, listening to a lecture by an astronomer. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and the diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Now, this poem has been read over the years by just about everyone who's written about it, talked about it, as showing Whitman's sort of disdain and disgust for the abstract workings of science and for the necessity of going one-on-one and experiencing the world, not having it mediated by all of the facts and figures that science puts between you and your experience of the world. But I was always bothered when I read this poem, when I had that reading of it in mind, or that interpretation. There's something in my experience of the poem didn't coordinate with that kind of reading. You know, it's a poem, if we just look at the lines, and they have to be broken on the page here. It looks better on the copy that I gave you, because you can see how those lines, the first 4 lines, just keep kind of expanding. The poem becomes very, very talky. You can see the syllables extend out in one line, I think 18, and it becomes very, very long. And we get columns, and we get figures and facts and diagrams and charts. All of the diction of those first lines is putting everything into a kind of categorized form. And you even see, if you just move your eyes down the left-hand side, that the first 4 lines give you literally a column of lens, right? And almost a column of eyes that come after. And if you think about what organ of the body is being stimulated in those opening lines, it's the ear, right? It's the hearing. But the hearing is embodied, right, in that word, and embodied in that word. There are the ears, they're right in those words, but they're embodied in, and everything is passively happening. When the I appears, it's in the passive voice, right? I was shown. The I isn't actively doing, the I is passively receiving. Right? And receiving through the ears, through the hearing and the learning. And it's again that passive position of sitting and again hearing the astronomer in the lecture room, and lecture itself, that word which means to pick apart, put everything in its proper place. And then it shifts in the last 4 lines, as the lines begin to move toward silence, and you can see that on the page. You can hear it with your ear as you hear the poem. And the I becomes an active I now that begins to actually do things rather than have things done to it. And as the I walks out of that lecture room, it becomes, that's a strange word in there, unaccountable. I, how soon, unaccountable I. It's a kind of unaccountable I and an uncountable I, right? That I that can't be diagrammed, put onto a chart, put into rows of facts and figures. But what always bothered me about this poem is when he rises and glides out. How different it would be if he said, I stood and stepped out. If he stood and stepped out, it would still be in divisions. But rising and gliding takes away all the kind of divisiveness. So all of the diction in these first 4 lines is now turning into a kind of flow in these last lines. The I becomes a sort of uncountable and unaccountable I. And walks out by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence of the stars. And that's what always bothered me when I read the poem, was from time to time. It seems like such a casual, throwaway thing for such an important moment. And from time to time I looked up in perfect silence of the stars. And one time when I was reading it, it hit me what I was seeing. Do you hear how this poem is not really about what Whitman rejects from the learned astronomer, but rather what he has ingested from all those facts and figures that the astronomers put up on the board, so that when he walks out by himself into this mystical, moist night air, he now realizes something he never realized before. And that is, when he looks up into the sky, he's looking from time to time. From this time to an entirely other time. And this is one of those moments where I recognize that Whitman, who himself was a great reader of science, he would read every science article he could get his hands on. And what he was reading in the 1850s and into the 1860s in astronomical discussions is the beginning of what we now know as light years. The beginning of understanding that light took time to travel. And that when we look at the night sky, we're not seeing stars, we're seeing time. We're seeing different times in our own. It even takes 8 seconds for the sun's light to get us, so we're always seeing the sun 8 seconds beyond the sun. And for many, many stars, we're seeing them hundreds, thousands of years later, millions of years later. Some stars that we see in the sky aren't there in the now that star's living in. Right? And the same goes in reverse. So that what initially appears to be a kind of casual throwaway line is actually the line that indicates why the poem really is When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. Yeah, I can only take so much of the facts and the figures that they're putting up there, because it was really Bessel's discovery of the time light travels that he has in mind that would have been put up there on the board, that he carries with him out. And now, what really makes that night look mystical, in a way that it never seemed mystical before, is that every time we look up into the night sky, we're time traveling. And on those distant stars, if they're still there, and they're getting light from our sun and this little solar system, they're seeing not us, but this world as it was thousands of years ago. So what turns the night air into something mystical is what he learned in the lecture hall. And it's one of the lessons I've always taken away from Whitman in that other section, which I'll just let you read on your own, from Song of Myself, is the section where he really begins to celebrate what all the sciences of the languages, the sciences of the chemists, the sciences of the physicists, the astronomers, what they're all bringing him. And he can't get enough of it to turn it into poetry. Not to turn away from it in order to write poetry, but to write through it into a new understanding. Okay. Well, it's been fun talking to all of you, and if any of you have any particular questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But I know we've got to move on now, right? So, yes, Randy.
Not a question, but I wonder if going back to what your remarks about the scrapbook, since they have so many alumni here, that you might mention that Dick Bowerly did a good deal of work in that scrapbook and wrote a poem about the scrapbook. I think it's in the book. Oh, yeah. Valley wrote the poem
Oh, Dick Balloway's
about
poem.
the scrapbook.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And where can we get that?
There's one on my desk at home.
One on your desk? Great. Great. Okay, yes,
You're at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, right?
yes.
So you have a world-renowned physics and astronomy department there. It'd be interesting to teach to some, to maybe have a panel sometime with some physics and astronomy students and your students or professors or whatever. But
Yeah.
I think it'd be, because Iowa is such a strong, because of Van Allen.
It's got a great astronomy and physics department, and James Van Allen, who discovered the Van Allen radiation belt, was a longtime professor at Iowa, and a good friend of mine until he died a few years ago. And in fact, it was a physicist at Iowa last year that I was talking to and said, this is how I'm reading this poem. And I said, when would light years have been discovered? He said, oh, well, we've been talking about Bessel, and that would have been the 1840s, the 1850s. So that started me then thinking, so this is not something I'm just hearing here. This is actually exactly when this would have been what he was hearing in the lecture room. And so, yeah, it was actually one of the great things about the University of Iowa is it's a big university in a relatively small city. And so boundaries are really permeable. And you meet a physicist at a dinner party, and then you run into him in a restaurant, and then you run into him in a grocery store. And you just keep conversations going. And I've had lots of conversations with physicists at Iowa. And at the very center of the bridge between the biology building and the physics building, there's a bridge over the main street in Iowa City. And at the very center of that bridge is a quotation from Whitman. So the Whitman quotation, which is about a leaf of grass is the journey work of the stars, and it stands in gold right at the heart between biology and physics. Thank you. Yeah.
When was this poem written?
This poem was written during the Civil War, and it's interesting to me that it was a Civil War poem, because one of the things that's happening, one of the things that Whitman imagines, because of what he's learned about time travel when you look at the sky, is that he can begin to construe you as a reader, living hundreds of years after him, who had absolutely no existence when he wrote. And yet, if he sits there and says, I'm looking and I see you and I can imagine you and you're holding me there, then he can begin to write these amazing poems that feel almost magical as you're reading them, because it's I know I'm dead. And you're the one who's breathing. You're alive. And you weren't alive when I lived, but I had a body just like you did, and I know what it was like. I know what it's like to breathe and to hold this book, like you're doing right now. And so we're doing something right now, aren't we, that all the preachers have preached but could never prove. But you and I can prove it, and that is the living can talk to the dead. And the dead can talk to the living. And we're doing it at this moment, physically, when you're holding this book. And that was part of the mass death during the war that he was dealing with, that began with a sense that even the things that were not actually there when you imagine them, even when you view them, you can still begin to construct them. And so Whitman's construction of the reader, you, living 150 years after Whitman, is part of the power of what he was able to produce.
Is anybody else that has written poetry like he has?
I think Whitman's poetry is unique. There are a lot of people who tried to write Whitman-like poetry and failed. I think there are a lot of poets who have picked up on aspects of Whitman and done it very, very well. I agree with Borges, who said that this idea of Whitman, creating this voice that speaks across time to the reader, no one else has been able to accomplish. Lots of people have tried, but nobody's been able to accomplish it. So
Well, I wondered if he lived long enough. When did he die?
he died in 1892.
I'm a physicist, so I was trying to see if he overlapped with the theory of relativity, and I got some thought about.
Yeah. Well, very relatively, of course.
I mean, this is the interpretation of time, because I don't know, I couldn't interpret it like you, because I would think, that's why I'm missing the voice idea. I think, well, if you lived in the desert, it wouldn't be voice. And then from time to time, I move my head.
Yeah.
But I see a whole lot more stars in the mountains than I do here.
Yeah.
What did he, now, the voice there must have been somewhere in Ohio, right?
Yeah, actually, for him, it was the mystical voice night air he was experiencing at that time was in Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
So it was the swampy night air of the Potomac swamp at the time.
But I related the first part of it is, because I had Sam Pratt for English.
Oh, yeah. So did
I
I.
walked in that sort of first day, I could reverse that. When I first heard Sam Pratt, with what he was trying to tell me to do, I couldn't understand it. And I ran fast in the physics book.
And now you know you did the right thing. Yeah. Great. I should let you all go. Thank you.